Hello everyone and welcome to a special edition of Moose Motion. During this video we'll be, going behind the scenes a little bit and showing you how I do my stop motion animation cartoons starting from the storyboard all the way to the film set. Anyway, take it away Milton!
Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well, and thank you for tuning into Moose Motion. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed the content, comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new, and be sure you have your post notifications turned on so you don't miss any of the new content. Anyway, thank you for your support, it's highly appreciated.
So generally how I like to start my more complex stop motion cartoons is usually starting with a storyboard, which is basically a crudely drawn cartoon or a set of instructions on what you basically want to take place during your animation. So effectively during this process, you get down all your camera angles and various instruction pieces that may be, a little complex and hard to communicate or forgotten later on during your animation process. So for lack of a better description, it's basically a cheat sheet of a poorly drawn comic of what your animation is going to be. So essentially you're going to have a set of instructions of what's going to be taking place scene by scene. Now sometimes your, comic strip isn't long enough, so you're going to have to do a little red arrow letting you know that this is the same camera angle that you're going to be using as before. Just something I generally do for my little cheat sheets. Everyone's different. Some professional studios basically do very similar methods as to what I'm doing, and it generally helps communicate things down the line for, more complex cartoons. And when it comes to basically leaving yourself a set of instructions, you're basically writing a set of little strips and arrows of what movements are going to be taking place with what characters or what characters being drawn in that particular scene. Now I'll admit there isn't really a whole lot of other commentary to cover during this section of the video. Basically it's a crudely drawn comic and it's by no means a drawing tutorial video because I'm not necessarily proud of the drawings that I'm doing on this particular comic strip. I probably did do a little bit more detail than usual because it is actually on, I'm filming this process, which generally it's never filmed at all because I don't want to give away too much. So I admit there isn't really too much to really say here because I don't want to give too much away on the actual animation. And perhaps if you're new, best time to subscribe so that way you can, be informed when the next animation is going to be come up, because there's definitely a lot of work that goes into these cartoons and a lot that basically goes unseen, and this is basically a good example for some of those who are perhaps making their own cartoons and give themselves a little bit more, insight on what things can be or what things are like at professional studio levels, and if you want to try and perhaps take it to the next level and do it on your own. And if you're doing big complex projects, it definitely really helps having a storyboard. I personally really enjoy doing this aspect because it kind of lets your imagination run wild and it gets your thoughts on paper, and that way you're not stuck trying to remember scene by scene, because there are times where I kind of forget to do things during that process because I'm overwhelmed with the amount of pictures that I have to take. So yeah, this is definitely not the best example of my drawing capabilities. I do have other drawing tutorials, but this is basically just how I like to start my more complex animation cartoons. By no means do I need to actually do this because I'm not a professional studio, but I just generally like to do this because it really does help with the animation process, and it kind of helps you figure out what you want to be doing during that step, because it's a lot to think about while you're doing it, and if it's just one less thing to make it a little bit easier, it does help a lot in the long run. Now that the storyboarding is pretty much finished, it's time to move on to cleaning up the clay cast of characters. Now, I generally like to think these characters or these clay dolls as my actors, so to speak, because, if you really think about it, they basically are kind of actors in a way. They are just kind of inanimate objects in the long run. However, bringing them to life through animation kind of gives them a whole different set of different attitudes and variations, and as you spend more time with them, the more you learn about them, especially the little orange hot rod in the background there. I've had that doll for about 2 years, and I've had, quite a few fond memories of playing with that thing at this point in my life, I would say. And I'm looking forward to, making a lot more fond memories with this particular little red skyline, because I think it'll be fun. Now, one step in particular that's important is keeping things clean, which I'm kind of guilty as charged of not using gloves a lot of the time because I don't like how they kind of lose that sense of feeling, and as a sculptor, it's kind of important to have that. But when you're trying to keep things clean, because that's kind of the important step here that we're basically doing, is we're giving a good scraping and scraping off all that dirty clay that's basically unwanted and doesn't necessarily look very good, because we essentially want our actors to actually look their best while they're being, shot on camera for the very first time. So now that all the scraping is done, it's time to clean up the tool marks, essentially, which I like to basically just kind of pet my models over. And then once you've done that, well, a lot of the lines are generally kind of faded out, so you kind of have to give the body a once over and clean everything up there, which is generally a lot easier said than done, because sometimes the lines are basically faded to almost non-existent because, well, you're scraping away a really fine layer of clay, and sometimes, well, these body lines don't really stick out very much at that point. So it's not exactly a very easy step. It doesn't look hard, but it's one that I have a bad habit of kind of dreading, so it can be very easily screwed up, let's just put it that way. Now, I must admit, I don't have a whole lot to say until we get to the Therizinosauridae. Now that the skyline's all cleaned up, we're going to move on to, well, this second clay cast character, which is, well, the Therizinosaurus. So, well, basically the same process here, nothing too fancy. Scrape off the 30 layers of clay and then clean things up afterwards, doing your more fine details. Apart from that, that's about it. So yeah, just enjoy the content for now, and then after this segment, we'll get into more of the nitty-gritty on how to actually make these characters come to life. Now, before I completely cut off the voiceover for this aspect of the video, I will give a quick shout out to Amberly Rust for spotting Milton the Moose in the Supercut edition for the Therizinosaurus. Congratulations, Amber, for spotting Milton. Now, for those of you who are unaware of this little challenge, well, there's a little moose that tends to show up in the background, so keep your eyes peeled, and well, if you've gotten this far, I'll give you a hint. He's already come and gone. So if you want a shout out and your comment pinned at the top of the comment section, timestamp correctly when that goofy little character shows up, and well, you'll get a shout out. So good luck, dear viewers. Hello everyone, so during this part of the video we'll be going over, well, the film set aspect of things. During this part I'll be kind of showing you step-by-step instructions on how I personally do the movements on my characters, and obviously you don't necessarily need a film set to do these sort of things, although it does kind of help, well, immerse people into a world a little bit further, I would say, and not to mention it's kind of fun having your own basically entire diorama set that you can kind of play with. In my case it's an entire small town made of Lego, so I think that's personally pretty cool. So if you have a lot of Lego, there's definitely a lot of things that you can do with it, and well, really, realistically, the only limit is your imagination. So one of the first steps that we're going to cover is, well, oddly enough, wardrobe. Especially when it comes to stop motion, where your clothing is actually a lot more important than one would really kind of think. Now, obviously, I'm wearing all black. Now, that's probably one of the best colors you can actually be wearing for stop motion because, well, it doesn't actually reflect any light off it at that point. So, say, bright colors especially, you don't want to be wearing because basically all of your small little movements in the background will possibly cause a odd reflection and give you a weird kind of fluttering effect, which you obviously don't want during your animation. So obviously step 1 is wear, well, nice dark colors. Now we'll move on to step 2. So step 2 will depend on what type of character you're kind of working with. Obviously I'll go through the different types of characters. Obviously if it's going to be a car, it's going to be slightly different than, say, if you're working with something a little bit more organic, like, say, a dinosaur or a person. It also depends on, well, whether or not it's a new character that you've never really worked with before, or something that you have in the past and perhaps have known for quite a few years. So, step 1, we'll dive into, well, the skyline. Now, in order to do stop motion cars, one would imagine that it is fairly easy, although it depends on, well, the level of detail that you kind of want to take things to. If you just want things to kind of move back and forth without actually really looking like a car actually in motion, then it's fairly easy. However, if you would like to go through all the process and pain in the steps that it takes to make all the tiny details move and make it look like it's mechanically functioning, it does take a little bit more time. Now, the big difference between my stop-motion dolls, or especially my stop-motion cars in particular, being that they're handmade, I have a kind of an advantage over having, say, just a regular Hot Wheels. But one could do the same thing, or apply perhaps similar methods to it. Essentially, these little handmade engines are mounted on sticky tack little engine mounts, so that way they can actually rock back and forth, making it look like the car is idling or trying to start up. And obviously the belt is able to move around and flop around. Obviously the Skyline has the same capabilities, but the hood is technically on it at the time being. It will definitely not be ripped off in the near future, not foreshadowing whatsoever. Rar. Now, one other important step or tiny buried detail that most people generally wouldn't notice, but you definitely notice if it's not there, which I will demonstrate on the 32 Ford here again, just because it's on a little easier angle for me to work with, and it's getting late at night while I'm filming this. So basically, this little cotton ball piece here can act as exhaust, so what you can do in between frames is just kind of shift it around and then, well, back your hand out of it and take a few pictures, and then obviously reposition it. And as well, this exhaust is technically movable. It's on a little sticky tack mount, so you can make that move around because technically the exhaust also shakes on a lot of cars. Although the Skyline does not have the same capabilities due to the fact that it's got just kind of one big stink cannon at the back. However, it's got, well, a little drift toy which will obviously have its own rules applied to, well, physics as it's flopping around on the road. So obviously the same sort of technique applies to the exhaust. Essentially, all you have to do is, well, poke the piece of pizza in between frames, back your finger out, and take a few pictures. Now that we got all the tiny little mechanical details, well, out of the way, it's time to, well, probably discuss the most important aspect of things, the movement. Now, there's a lot more to that than, well, just moving things back and forth, especially considering, well, there's generally a lot of weight distribution involved with cars, especially. So, a lot of people will probably notice that the suspension on my cars is generally a little bit sloppy and kind of actually plays up and down just a certain degree. Now, that is strategically done on purpose. Now, I'll demonstrate why. So, the method behind that madness in particular is, well, essentially going to take a little piece of clay or, well, some sort of weight thing, generally something darker color so it won't be as noticeable. This is just kind of what I have in hand. Black is obviously a preferred color, as previously stated, for your wardrobe attire. So the weight distribution thing, so this is going to be a little difficult to kind of demonstrate considering I'm holding a cell phone in one hand. Basically, you're going to want to slide your piece of clay underneath the car there, and basically just kind of have it support up on top. Now, depending on your camera angle, obviously you're going to have to be a little bit careful on where it is. You can't really have a low camera angle because then obviously people can see your magic trick. So you're going to want to generally do kind of a higher up advantage point depending on what the car is especially doing, especially for the 32 Ford in particular here. It generally does have to be angled upright because, well, the thing's got a fairly, well, open front end, and I usually like to make this thing do different wheelies. And, well, if you'd like to see that in action, be sure to check out the links in the post description after you're watching this video. So, well, actually I'll provide small clips afterwards, but maybe, we'll see. I'm tired, so. But same rules apply for the Skyline. The only issue is, well, it's obviously not going to be doing wheelies quite nearly as intensely as the Hull Hot Rod. This is more of a drift car, this is more of a drag car. Now it's time to cover probably the most important process of, well, animating a car, the movement. Most in particular, the acceleration process and how to get good acceleration from a dead stop to, well, moving along the track. Now, obviously, you're going to want to take care of your whole weight distribution thing, so once that is taken care of, and, well, honestly, oddly as it sounds, your probably first two frames are basically just going to be that, not actually moving the car whatsoever. Once the weight distribution thing is taken care of, then, well, obviously you can start moving the car forward. Now, your first step isn't going to be a whole lot. You're just going to want to kind of inch it, maybe quarter inch or so. And then, given that these things are kind of having sloppy handmade suspension, you kind of have to adjust the wheels and make things spin a little bit. And then you can just basically continue taking your hand out of the frame and taking a few pictures. And I should probably quickly clarify the few pictures. By that, I mean I'm usually working in frames of 2, so that means 2 and 24 frames per second. Now, there are varying types of, well, movement depending on what you're doing. If you're doing something fast, like a punch or swinging a car in the future, not foreshadowing, you basically might want to do single movement frames. Now, most people generally do 2 and 24 because it looks pretty smooth, although some do 3 and 30. So after you moved your car about a quarter inch, you're basically going to want to continue that, well, process in moving the car forward ever so slightly, basically going from a quarter inch to maybe about 5/16 or 3/8, and basically continuing on and on and on until it gets to about an inch or so. And obviously you're going to be taking your hands out of frames each movement, but essentially once you kind of build up enough of a acceleration point, you can kind of get away with bigger and bigger movements without it actually looking too janky. Now, due to this being, well, a JDM car in particular, it's probably best I do a little drift segment and give you a quick run through on how that works. And, well, essentially it's not too much different than a lot of the acceleration process, apart from you're going to have to, well, deal with different angles depending on, well, the road, as well as probably smoke, which can be quite a hassle depending on how much of, well, time and detail you're willing to spend on that stuff. Now, the movement method, it remains pretty much the same as, well, accelerating, except the only difference is you're basically kind of turning things, accelerating sideways, essentially. So you kind of want to keep the car on an angled projection and, well, obviously think about things ahead of time, kind of being like a real drifter and knowing where the car is going to have to go and angling your steering wheel accordingly. Obviously, and obviously the same sort of rule applies. Every movement, you have to take your hand out of frame, take a few pictures, and then depending on your tripod setup, if the car is, well, sitting still, or your camera sitting still, essentially, you can just leave things in one spot. But if the camera's moving essentially with it, obviously you're going to take your movement with your car, and then obviously move the camera ever so slightly to keep the car in frame center, depending on the shot. Now to go over smoke details, which can be quite, well, rewarding, but a very big pain in the butt from what I have unfortunately experienced, because it can take a lot of time and it's extremely hard to get a good interpretation. So the idea, if you want to be lazy, you can basically just kind of poke things and then move your hand out of frame and take a couple pictures. And obviously if the car is moving, then, well, in this case it's drifting, it's going to be, well, moving with it. So a lot of the time the tires are going to be spinning. So one added detail I generally like to do, which I'm not going to exactly mush things in like I usually do during the animation process, because I just cleaned the car. I'd like to keep it nice and clean for the animation. So basically what you want to do with the smoke in that case, so to make it kind of look like it's rotating with the tire, is just kind of give it a little bit of a twist and just kind of make it look like it's rotating with it. So as obviously time progresses and you take multiple frame pictures with it kind of twirling around, it kind of makes it look like it's spinning with the tire essentially. And one other little detail that you can do, which unfortunately I thought I had a piece of clay kicking around, but there's some old, well, rubber remnants from some previous burnouts that I can use here. So just taking little chunks of black clay and then just sticking those onto various parts of the smoke too, just to give it that added effect of making it look like, well, it's actually burning and ripping up these tires. That part generally I find is very, very tedious, and I'm almost not very happy with doing that sometimes, but it does actually look like it's realistic smoke in the end, and it is generally worth the experience doing it. But yeah, if you're going to that level of detail, be prepared to be spending almost 10 minutes per frame. Now, obviously, the same sort of logic applies to doing a regular burnout. The only difference is, obviously, the car is going to be sitting still, and, well, obviously, the smoke will be spinning and rotating with the tires. The only difference is you're going to want to add a lot more, obviously, over time. Now that we've covered the basic movement of vehicles, now it's time to go over the dinosaurs. Now, for these particular types of characters, it's really going to depend on what kind of movements they're doing. It's either going to be a very slow one or a particularly fast one, so we'll cover the slow ones first. So probably one of the most important things about working with characters like these in particular is to make sure that you have a secure base to work with. So a lot of the time what I like to do with my characters is basically add sticky tack to the bottom of their feet, so that way you can basically stick them to the surface that you're working on, and it gives you a slightly better, well, surface to actually work with and, well, play with the face or the arms without having to worry about everything else falling. Once you get your character into place, then you can start working on small, tiny movements. So generally speaking, when you're doing smaller movements, you basically just want to tilt things ever so slightly, like maybe that much. Now take a couple pictures, and then basically continue. Then perhaps after, several hundred frames, you'll have an entire, well, head movement, and then you can start with the jaw and various other little things like that. So I would give it a good estimate of maybe like a 16th or less, depending on how patient you are and what the movement is, well, being taken place. So that's pretty much the gist of doing small movements. Essentially just do very, very small increments of movements, about 1 or 2 millimeters for you who use the metric system. So you basically have to have a whole lot of patience. Now we're going to move on to, well, doing some faster steps. Now ironically, this is probably the slower dinosaur. That being said, I have some plans for his arms in the future where he's going to be yeeting certain things into a decent, well, distance. Anyway, let's cover some fast movements. So when you're doing faster movements, it's actually a lot less work than doing, well, much slower ones. You can get away with a little bit more jankiness, and, well, usually when you're, say, throwing a punch or winding up for something, you kind of want to move the entire body with it, like it's doing a twist motion, and just kind of move the hand up, perhaps in, say, 1/4 inch to 3/16 increments. Then once you have your wind up in place, or well, whatever it is you're doing, you kind of usually want to have some sort of build up towards that fast motion, otherwise it kind of looks very out of place. You can then start moving things fairly quickly. Essentially, your first movement, kind of the same logic applies to, well, hitting a car or whatever it is you're hitting when it comes to accelerating a car. Basically, your first movement's going to be a little bit less than normal, and then you're basically just going to want to, well, take your couple frame pictures, and then proceed to, well, accelerate. And then depending on how fast the movement is, you can even do single frames to make it look like it's moving really fast. Same sort of reasoning applies to, well, walking or running. Basically, you want to slow things down a little bit and do smaller movements for walking and running. And one tip I can provide for those of you who are trying to do things that are walking, generally speaking, it's a good idea to always kind of hide your feet, especially with the clay models in particular, because you're going to probably smush things into an unrecognizable state sometimes, and you definitely don't want to show that on camera because it kind of takes things away. So that's when you kind of have to play with clever camera angles. So seeing how we're on the topic of camera angles, one can do a few different things to obviously achieve those to get the clever ones. Obviously a tripod is probably a little bit easier to work with to get the nice fluent motions, and as well as the up high angles. Now if one wants to be a little bit more clever and work on a budget to get nice, well, close-up shots, I personally use my crude Lego, well, tripod here, which actually works quite well, and well, mainly because it was basically cost next to nothing. And the nice part about it is that I can generally use it for the cars to kind of move alongside with it. So yeah, it's up to you. You can either use some alternative methods or get a nice tripod. Now I do have one more recommendation before I wrap this video up. If you're using your cell phone like me in particular for stop motion animation or any camera in particular, it's usually best to use a remote. And one thing you can do if you're using a cell phone like I mentioned, you can use your little, well, microphone or the volume button to actually, well, take a picture. That way you're not actually touching the screen a bunch of times, causing unwanted camera jank. Now, hopefully this has inspired you that anyone basically can do your own little stop motion cartoons, even if you're, well, very limited to your tech like me with just a cell phone. And if you have any other suggestions or, well, questions, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, that's enough for me. Till next time, take it easy.